Marilyn moved through the back courtyard of the psychiatric hospital with the uneasy grace of someone who knew she didn't belong there, her heels tapping softly against the concrete as a sharp wind clawed at her coat, pulling loose strands of hair across her face like pale ribbons. She had come only to visit a friend who'd fallen into exhaustion, but the moment she stepped outside into the cold, the world felt wrong, hollow, distant, as though the night itself were listening. The lamp above her flickered in an irregular pulse, illuminating the derelict E-wing, a building the staff insisted had been sealed years ago. She tried to ignore its presence, to treat it as nothing more than a forgotten piece of the hospital's past, but then the sound came, a heavy thud, muffled but unmistakable, vibrating through the still air with the weight of a fist striking metal. She froze, skin prickling, breath suspended, and when the noise came again, harder, sharper, its echo slipped beneath her ribs like a cold blade. Something was inside the locked ward, something alive. She returned inside to report it, expecting alarm or urgency, but found only dismissive fatigue, the kind that comes from people who have learned not to see what is inconvenient. The nurse told her it was nothing, pipes, raccoons, the wind through broken vents, but Marilyn could feel the truth vibrating in her bones. Whatever was in that wing had not been an animal or a mechanical groan. It had been deliberate, it had been pleading, and so her fear shifted into resolve, the soft determination that defined her whenever she sensed a quiet cruelty being ignored by those who preferred comfort over conscience. She slipped into a dim supply room, heart racing with a mixture of dread and certainty, scanning the shadows until her fingers closed around a ring of keys coated in dust and indifference. She found one labelled with the very name the staff insisted no one entered anymore, E-wing sub-basement access, and something inside her tightened, the sense that she had stumbled upon a secret designed to stay buried. With a stolen flashlight, she moved through the silent corridors, guided by instinct more than logic, and reached the rusted metal door that marked the entrance to the abandoned ward. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though carrying the memory of all the fear that had once been sealed inside. When the key turned with a reluctant click, the bar slid free as if releasing a breath held for years, and as the door groaned open, the darkness inside greeted her not like absence but like awareness. Dust floated through the beam of her flashlight, turning the hallway into a tunnel of forgotten sorrow, peeling paint curling like old scabs, shattered tiles forming jagged constellations beneath her feet, medical equipment left in mid-motion as if the people who once used it vanished between breaths. She stepped deeper, the quiet swallowing each footfall until the space felt almost hollow of sound, and just when she wondered if her fear had tricked her, the knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate strikes from behind a door halfway down the hall. Her light landed on a tarnished number plate, 217. The door to the room was barricaded by 3 padlocks that were far too new for a wing supposedly abandoned years earlier. The implication spread through her like ice. Someone had been shut inside recently, deliberately. She leaned close, her pulse hammering, and though she could hear only faint movement through the thick door, the unmistakable sense of a person on the other side radiated outward, a presence clinging to life through sheer will. Shock gave way to horror as she studied the locks, realizing they required different keys that weren't on the ring she had stolen. She fled back toward the nurse's station, driven by the knowledge that whatever was happening inside this hospital was not neglect, but something colder, calculated. The staff responded with the same indifference as before, masks of apathy shielding something deeper, something that smelled of fear and guilt. In their eyes she saw not confusion, but the tense flicker of people who feared the truth being uncovered. She spotted a wall cabinet behind the nurse's desk, its door left slightly ajar, and inside she glimpsed a ring of keys, large, metallic, unmistakably important. Among them hung a tag marked 217 triple lock. The air thickened with the silent tension of unspoken wrongdoing, and Marilyn, fueled by a blend of rage and compassion that had no outlet in Hollywood soundstages or photo studios, knew she couldn't walk away. She moved faster than her fear could catch, seizing the keys before the nurse's alarm could rise into action, before anyone could stop her, before she could second-guess the reckless bravery that had always existed beneath her carefully constructed image. And as she sprinted back down the deserted corridor, the hospital behind her erupting into chaos and shouted orders, she didn't slow, didn't question, didn't waver. She ran toward the locked door of room 217 with the certainty of someone who had heard a human soul begging between the knocks, someone who understood that some debts were bound not by moral duty, but by the simple, aching truth that she had been the only one who listened. She reached the threshold, breath shaking, keys clattering in her trembling hand, and in that moment the entire hospital seemed to hold still, the air so silent it felt suspended, every shadow watching as she pressed the first key into the cold steel lock, knowing that whatever lay behind that door would not just change this night, it would change her. Marilyn jammed the first key into the lowest padlock, her pulse pounding as fiercely as the storm of footsteps beginning to echo from the distant ward entrance, and when the lock snapped open with a jolt, the metallic crack rang through the hallway like a gunshot. She didn't pause to breathe. The second key trembled in her grip as the fluorescent lights above her flickered with a dying hum, casting frantic shadows that made the corridor appear narrow and hungry, as though the hospital itself wished to swallow her before she could finish what she had begun. The second lock gave way with a stubborn groan, and with two barriers down the air seemed to tighten around her, thick with the suffocating smell of dust, antiseptic, and something sour beneath it, a scent of time rotting in stillness. She lifted the third key, the final gatekeeper, just as the shouts of orderlies grew clearer, their boots slamming against the linoleum in uneven sync, carrying the unmistakable urgency of people who knew a secret was seconds from exposure. She forced the last key into the lock, twisting until her wrist strained and the padlock snapped open with a violence that nearly made her drop it. The door, freed of its constraints, shuddered but didn't swing open. Something inside pressed against it from the other side. Slowly. With fear coiling through her like cold smoke, she pushed, feeling resistance, soft, human, exhausted. The door opened enough to reveal a sliver of darkness so thick her flashlight beam seemed swallowed whole. Then the shape appeared. A figure slumped against the door, thin as a shadow and wrapped in a hospital gown stained by time and neglect. The person's limbs were limp, skin pale from confinement, hair matted like a ghost dragged from the past. Marilyn knelt, slipping her arms beneath the frail form, and as she lifted, the body felt weightless in the way only starvation and forgotten suffering could make someone disappear into their own bones. She rolled the figure slowly onto the derelict bed nearby, the frame creaking with a sound that cut through her heart like a plea. The room around her looked abandoned for decades, rusted sink, shattered mirror, overturned medical tray, but the sheets beneath the patient were warm, proof that whoever had been trapped here had been alive, conscious and desperate only moments before. She scanned the walls, noticing deep scratches carved into the paint, long uneven trails made by fingernails or something harder, each mark a silent diary of fear and isolation. The footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by the metallic clatter of keys, and the rising panic of staff who realized she had opened the one door they had tried to bury under bureaucracy and neglect. She turned the flashlight onto the patient's wrists, where faint rope marks circled the skin, as though restraints had been removed recently and hastily, a last-minute attempt to hide cruelty. Her pulse surged with fury, and she grabbed a nearby wheelchair, its wheels stiff from disuse but functional enough, and lifted the patient into it with careful strength. She pushed out of the room just as the first shadow appeared at the end of the hall, tall and rigid, cutting through the flickering light like a pillar of authority warped by fear. She navigated the hallway, gidding the chair over cracks and debris, moving with the determination of someone who had abandoned every fear in favor of raw instinct. The ward seemed to stretch endlessly, its peeling walls closing in as though trying to force her back into the darkness she had awakened. She took a sharp turn, nearly colliding with a rusted cart, and the sound of pursuit intensified, the slap of shoes, the clipped gasps of people running not to save a life, but to prevent a truth from breathing. She pushed the wheelchair faster, the wheels squealing in protest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly over doors with room numbers long since erased by time. Her mind raced as she sought a way out, but every corridor seemed to coil back into itself like a maze built for containment rather than movement. Then she spotted it, a narrow service elevator at the far end, half concealed behind a curtain of fallen ceiling tiles. The doors were partly open, frozen as if the building had abandoned them mid-breath. She shoved debris aside, muscles burning, forcing the doors wider until the gap could admit the chair. A wave of stale, cold air rose from the shaft, carrying the metallic bite of machinery long dormant. She wheeled the patient inside and slammed the emergency lever, praying the system still held enough life to carry them down. The elevator shutters groaned, grinding with an ancient ache, and the doors began to inch closed just as two orderlies reached the end of the hallway, their silhouettes framed in the flickering light like spectres chasing a truth long overdue for release. The doors shut completely, plunging the elevator into darkness, broken only by the fragile glow of her flashlight. The car lurched downward in violent, uneven drops, each floor passing with a shudder that rattled through her bones. She steadied the wheelchair, gripping its handles as though holding onto gravity itself, while the patient's shallow breathing echoed softly against the metal walls. At the bottom, the doors creaked open to reveal a forgotten basement corridor flooded with the dim, jaundiced light of a single emergency bulb. She pushed forward, knowing that if she could reach the laundry exit on the far side, they might escape before the staff sealed them in again. The basement walls loomed close, lined with old gurneys and abandoned medical crates, their shadows long and twisted like memories no one wanted to revisit. Pipes groaned overhead, dripping condensation onto the cracked floor, and the air smelled of mold, metallic water, and the lingering residue of lives pushed into the margins. She guided the wheelchair around fallen equipment, her heartbeat sinking with the distant thrum of approaching chaos from the floors above. Every instinct told her she was running out of time, that the hospital, with all its secrets and silent bargains, was beginning to close in. She reached the locked laundry exit and fumbled with the keys again, her hands trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Behind her, the elevator rattled, signaling movement. Someone was following. She forced the key into the lock, twisting with desperation, and the door finally gave way, releasing a gust of cold night air that crashed into her like salvation. She pushed the wheelchair out into the moonlit loading yard, the concrete slick with dew, the sky above stretched black and starless like an unblinking eye. She didn't know where to go, didn't know if help would come, but she knew one truth with unshakable certainty. She had freed someone who should never have been abandoned, and now the entire hospital, its lies, its negligence, its hidden cruelty, was coming after her. She tightened her grip on the wheelchair, breathed once to steady her resolve, and stepped into the darkness with the patient and the truth she had unearthed clinging to her like a shadow that would follow her forever. Marilyn pushed the wheelchair through the loading yard as the cold night air knifed across her skin, her breath escaping in pale clouds that vanished almost instantly into the darkness. The hospital loomed behind her like a monolith of secrets, its windows glowing with a sickly yellow light, each square a silent witness to decades of neglect and the quiet cruelties that had been allowed to harden into routine. The patient's frail form slumped in the chair, their head resting loosely against the backrest, their chest rising and falling with barely perceptible breaths. Marilyn moved across the uneven ground with the instinct of someone who knew she had only moments before the staff poured out of the building behind her, their anger not fueled by concern for the patient, but by fear of exposure, fear of the truth she now carried with her like a burning brand in the darkness. She navigated the narrow corridor between supply crates until the yard opened onto a service alley cluttered with dumpsters and rusted metal barrels. Somewhere beyond the alley was the street. And somewhere beyond the street was safety, or at least the possibility of it. But her progress was slow, the chair rattling over cracked pavement, each jolt causing the patient to shudder with weak, involuntary tremors. She kept moving even as her muscles screamed, driven by the relentless certainty that stopping meant surrendering the fragile life she had pulled from the shadows. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant echo of slamming doors, raised voices, hurried footsteps spreading outward from the hospital's main entrance. They were already searching. She slipped into the shadows beside the tall brick wall of an adjacent building, just as a group of orderlies spilled into the loading yard, their flashlight beams slicing across the concrete like searching claws. She pressed herself close to the wall, holding the wheelchair's handles with white-knuckled intensity, willing the darkness to swallow them for just a moment longer. The beams swept dangerously close, illuminating the corners of the yard, the stacks of neglected equipment, the puddles shimmering beneath the security lights. Then, mercifully, the searchers moved toward the opposite side of the yard, drawn by some assumption or hope that she had chosen the easier path. Marilyn inhaled deeply, steadying her hands, and continued forward down the alley, each step a battle against both exhaustion and the growing weight of responsibility pressing into her spine. The patient's breathing rattled, thin and fragile, as though each inhale was scraped from the edges of survival. She needed help, real help, not the cold neutrality of a staff trained to overlook suffering. And Marilyn knew that the nearest refuge was the small night clinic 2 blocks away, the one run by volunteers who took in soldiers, drifters, the forgotten and overlooked and unprofitable. She aimed toward that memory like a lighthouse through fog. The alley emptied onto a street drenched in neon reflections from distant bars and late-night diners, a world that moved oblivious to the nightmare unfolding behind her. She crossed quickly, pushing the wheelchair up a curb that felt like a mountain, her legs quivering from strain. A passing car slowed, the driver staring with curiosity at the sight of a woman in an elegant coat pushing a near-lifeless figure through the midnight streets. But the car continued on without stopping, swallowed by the city's endless hum. Marilyn continued down the sidewalk, the hospital shrinking behind her but its presence still clinging like a shadow. Then she heard the footsteps, closer now, controlled, purposeful, not the chaotic stomp of orderlies but something more ominous. She looked back just enough to see two men in long coats stepping out from the hospital's side entrance, their movements sharp and intentional, as if they weren't searching but hunting. They headed down the sidewalk, scanning the street with a predatory calm that tightened every nerve in her body. She pushed faster, wheeling the patient around the corner of a closed drugstore, her lungs burning with the weight of panic. The city felt suddenly empty, devoid of witnesses, leaving her alone in a maze of cold, echoing streets. She reached the clinic's block just as one of the men turned the corner behind her, his silhouette a dark cutout against the glowing signs. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to keep moving without breaking into a sprint that would draw more attention. The clinic's door came into view, a simple wood frame with peeling paint and a small red cross painted on the glass. She pushed the wheelchair forward and slammed her shoulder against the door, praying it had not been locked for the night. To her relief, the latch clicked open, the door giving way just enough for her to maneuver the chair inside before she closed it behind her with trembling hands. The clinic was dimly lit, smelling of disinfectant and coffee left too long on a burner. She moved quickly through the hallway until she found an empty examination room, its cot neatly made, its equipment arranged with the careful precision of volunteers who cared too deeply for those the world forgot. She lifted the patient onto the cot, gently laying them down while her chest heaved with a mixture of fear and relief. Their breathing remained shallow, but their eyelids fluttered faintly, a sign of life struggling to stay tethered. Marilyn searched the cabinets and found a blanket, draping it over the frail body before grabbing a basin of water to clean the grime from their face. As she worked, she studied the patient's features, hollow cheeks, bruises along the temples, evidence of restraints on their wrists, all silent testimony to suffering hidden behind locked doors. She did not know who they were, why they had been abandoned, or what story the hospital had buried, but she knew the cruel truth. Someone had deemed this person disposable, and that was something she could never allow to stand. She stepped back and listened for footsteps outside the clinic, but the street remained quiet. Still, the danger had not passed. The hospital would not let this incident go quietly. Institutions built on silence rarely tolerated voices that disrupted their carefully constructed illusions. She sat beside the patient, exhaustion pouring through her like cold water, but she remained alert, every sense sharpened by adrenaline. Time stretched, the clinic's clock ticking with a slow rhythm that coaxed her thoughts into clarity. She realized that saving this one life was only the beginning. She had unlocked a door that had been sealed for reasons far more sinister than neglect. Whatever had happened in room 217 had roots deeper than the night staff's indifference. It hinted at corruption, malpractice, perhaps even deliberate isolation designed to erase someone from existence. And now she was part of the story, bound to it by her choice to listen to a knock when everyone else had turned away. As dawn began to bleed pale light through the clinic's windows, footsteps finally approached, the soft, hurried steps of a volunteer arriving for the early shift. Marilyn rose, steadying herself, prepared to explain only that someone needed help and that she had brought them to the only place she trusted. The volunteer gasped softly at the sight of the patient, but moved quickly into action, gathering equipment, checking vitals, beginning the process of care with no hesitation. For the first time since entering the locked ward, Marilyn felt the weight on her chest loosen. The patient was safe, but she was not finished. She stepped to the window and looked toward the hospital in the distance, now bathed in morning light that made its walls appear almost innocent, as though daylight could erase the horrors it concealed. She knew better. Darkness hid in places built to appear benevolent, and she had seen a glimpse of it, a truth cruel enough to demand exposure. She took a long breath, feeling resolve crystallize inside her like steel. The world would eventually learn what had been done in that sealed room. She would make sure of it. But for now, she allowed herself a silent moment of victory, knowing that she had saved someone who had been meant to vanish unnoticed. And as she stepped back into the room where the patient lay breathing more steadily under soft clinic light, Marilyn felt something rare and powerful settle into her bones. The certainty that even in the bleakest corners of the city, where institutions built walls around their sins, compassion could still shatter locks, break patterns, and pull a forgotten soul back into the world of the living.